Good morning, everyone. My name's Susanna, and I'm the Climate Change Policy Officer at Lancaster City Council. A conversation I have often starts with, "That's not a local accent." And this turns into a conversation about the weather, because welcome to England, and why I left sunny, blue sky, and warm Arizona to come to Lancaster, where it is cold, wet, and rainy. I came in 2017 to do a master's in environment and development at Lancaster University. So while I might not have come for the day-to-day weather, I have stayed because of the long-term climate. I am one of 3 officers in the Climate Hub at Lancaster City Council's planning policy. We work across the council on a range of projects and priorities, but our primary focus is on how we can steer planning policy to deliver more sustainable urban futures in the face of climate emergency. Today, we're going to look at how policies and local plans can support sustainable urban futures in the face of our climate crisis. Okay, so the first question is, what even is a local plan? It is effectively a vision for the future of the district. It's made up of policies. It sets out the way that we're going to interact with our built environment, how we're going to live, work, and play. It even looks at the way that we build our houses and the way that we're going to interact with the environment. These plans are prepared through a legal process. It starts with gathering evidence and designing different types of policies, testing policy options, going out to public consultation in different rounds, and modifying those policies based on consultation responses. These policies then go to an independent planning inspector where they go through an examination. And finally, they're adopted by local council. Local plans are used to help decide planning applications and inform other planning-related decisions. They shape where we should and should not build things, how and how not to build things, what areas we should protect. And they also help to inform infrastructure and community investment. They also determine our future patterns of development, and they're really important because without them, development will still take place, but it might not be in the right places, and it might be without the infrastructure that we need to live good lives. So how does this fit in with the climate emergency? Led by the young people in this district, Lancaster declared a climate emergency in 2019. This joined Lancaster City Council to thousands of local authorities across the globe in committing to tackle this climate crisis head on. These local authorities represent over 1 billion people globally. And it committed this council specifically to helping the district reach net zero by 2030. The climate emergency declaration also sparked a climate emergency local plan review, where we went through the local plan and said, how can we make our planning policies? We looked at our policies through the lens of climate adaptation and mitigation and said, how can we make these give us better climate outcomes? And we also looked to maximize co-benefits, or how could we have a policy with an aim which had wider impacts than just the policy direction? We looked at everything from green and blue infrastructure to sustainable travel to decarbonizing historic buildings. And today we're going to look at 2 of our biggest areas for mitigation and adaptation: energy use in homes and addressing flood risk. We need policies to drive emissions reductions. If you look at the graph that's on the screen, the pink represents the carbon the emission scenario and warming scenario we would have globally if there were no climate policies in place. The orange is the policies that we have today and the emissions and temperature scenario associated with that. That puts us on track for a 2.5 to 2.9 degree world, well above the 1.5 degree world of the Paris Agreement, as shown on this graph by the teal line. We have to put policies in place in order to avoid the worst of losses and damages associated with the climate crisis. Unfortunately, the share of greenhouse gas emissions is increasing, even today. The built environment is responsible for one of the biggest, fastest growing portions of that share, and most of that's associated with buildings. Buildings represent over 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and a lot of that's associated with homes. This is often from poorly designed, inadequately insulated, and energy inefficient buildings. Here in Lancaster, our homes represent more than 50% of the emissions associated with the built environment, as seen in orange on this graph. If we're going to have a more sustainable urban future, we're going to need to start retrofitting. And we're going to have to start building new buildings, which are on the path to net zero. This is important not just for the planet. You see, in 2020, 15.1% of households in Lancaster were impacted by energy poverty. This was before the current energy crisis. Today, that number is expected to be much, much higher. What if we had homes that didn't need so much energy? What if we could still live in beautiful, modern, comfortable, warm homes without the expense? We have the technology and the know-how to do that, but what we're missing are the policy drivers. So, what can local plans do? National government sets out that the planning system should shape places in ways which lead to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Local authorities have the ability to set their own energy efficiency and renewable energy standards, but very few do because the planning system is generally in favor of sticking to national targets. National government is also looking to reduce emissions. If you look at this graph, the orange bar represents the emissions associated with an archetypal home here in an archetypal home built last year to the previous building regulations. The government's new building regulations are represented in blue, and you can see that the emissions have dropped a little bit. The government's also proposing a future home standard, which includes solar PV, and you can see in the purple bar here. The problem is these homes are designed to be what the government says are zero carbon ready. They're only zero carbon if and when the grid decarbonizes in 2035. And also, these are still homes that need a lot of energy. Here in Lancaster, it's not just about the emissions, it's also about people. So we wanted to see, is there a sustainable way to reduce carbon emissions while also improving social equity? So we designed a policy based around Fabric First principles, which is based on passive house principles. And this is shown here on the graph in green. You can see that the emissions associated with that house are even lower than the government's future home standard. If you put solar PV on that house, you get a house that is carbon negative or is actually exporting more energy to the grid than it's using. And that's the bright blue on that far side of the graph. So this is a house that is truly net zero, even if the grid does not decarbonize. With each increment in warming, the adverse impacts and related losses and damages we're going to experience escalate. The climate disaster most likely to be felt by people is flooding. Last year, this colossal flood in Western Europe was 9 times more likely due to human-caused climate change. And this year, Pakistan's devastating floods covered more than 1/3 of the country in water in monsoon storms, which were 10 times heavier than normal, following an unprecedented heat wave, which melted more glacial ice than expected. Here in Lancaster District, we've experienced several episodes of flooding. This is a picture of Storm Desmond in 2015, during which 400 properties were flooded and 68,000 properties were affected through things like lack of electricity or restricted access. In Lancashire, 20% of all the properties impacted were here in this district. This flood was called unprecedented. And yet in 2017, 2 years later, another flood hit. And this time, 67% of all the properties in Lancashire affected were right here. The Climate Emergency Local Plan Review took a hard look at these numbers. And we said, how can we address flooding differently? We know that people are impacted by sea, river, surface water, groundwater, and sewer flooding, and so we made policies to address all types of flooding. We also looked at the way in which we could optimize and maximize the uptake of sustainable urban systems like the one that's on the screen here to provide multifunctional benefits. Systems such as these not only reduce flood risk, but they also provide green space for people, and they increase biodiversity, create habitat space, and also contribute to urban cooling. So where does the research at Lancaster University does fit in? Remember back at the start of this talk, I was talking about how we develop policies and we start with an evidence base. In order to make a new policy or to change a policy that we have to have robust evidence underpinning it. A few weeks ago, the Lancaster Environment Center launched the report on soils for planning and construction. And this was a collaborative project with Lancaster University, Cornwall Council, Farah Huxley, JTP, and ourselves, which was kickstarted when we went to the soils group at the Environment Center and we said, hey, can planning do anything to help protect soil carbon and improve soil integrity? How important is it? And what is our role? It turns out planning does have a role, and this report will now form part of the evidence base underpinning policy development for the Lancaster South Area Action Plan. The same has been for the Hope Spots project with the urban team or the Placemaking with Young Adults project. It's not just projects like these, though. Student dissertations have also helped to help form the evidence base for a more sustainable urban future here in Lancaster. We need policies in order to meet the challenge of the climate emergency. This is not something we can do alone, and it is not something we can do in our silos. This is a time for transdisciplinary working. We have to act creatively, in partnership, with communities and across sectors to meet this challenge and deliver policies for a sustainable urban future. We're a very small local authority in the grand scheme of things, but through collaboration and determination, the impacts will be felt beyond the boundaries of our district. In the face of the climate emergency, we are working hard to make sure that this district's planning policies can deliver local solutions to global climate challenges. Thank you very much.